Good morning, everyone. My name is Debbie Forster. I'm the CEO of the Untitled Chapter, and I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the TTC Flexi Festival, our very first. Great to have you here online. I'd rather have you in the room with me, but we'll do what we can. This is our morning coffee session, so I hope you have your cup. I noticed someone on social media yesterday took a picture of this with their beverage of choice in camera. So there's your challenge thrown down to you today. So if we were in the same room, I'd take these first few minutes to do those housekeeping on where's the fire exit, what to do, where the loos are, etc. But instead, I'm going to talk to you about the screen. Now, I realize if you tuned in yesterday, and if you did, thanks, and thanks for coming back. I'm now going to become one of those flight attendants that's giving you the same old instructions of what to hear and the exits here, etc. So my apologies. But if you're new to us today, what you'll notice is that everything you need for today's discussion is here on your screen. So in this screen, you'll be hearing us, you'll be hearing from me, you'll be hearing a fireside chat, you'll be hearing from the panel. But it's not just that we want to talk to you, we want to hear from you. So if you cursor down just a little bit below this window, you'll find that there are 2 tabs. One of those tabs is Q&A, kind of self-explanatory, but this is something we want you to use. As our panel are discussing, we hope that you have questions that you'd like to ask them. Put those in there. We'll be feeding those in at the panel discussion. You'll notice there's a second tab that says poll. Now, poll is because we want you to give us more information. You know, if you know the Tech Talent Charter, data information is key to us. So you'll see that we've already put in a poll for you. Now, this poll is going to be asking you about what's happening in terms of ethnicity, Black representation, etc. within your company. We'd really like you to add that and fill that poll in for us. Now, as we're talking, I'm going to make references to what's happening at lunch today, what's happening for our evening cuppa. I'll talk about what's happening tomorrow. Now, if as you're listening, you suddenly think, oh my goodness, how did I not sign up for that session? I really want to be there. Don't worry, we can help you. Go down a little farther on the page. You will see the agenda for the day, and you will see the agenda and sign up details that you can get in for today, for tomorrow's session. And we'd love to have you there. Now, we will also, during today's sessions, be referring to things like our annual report. The TTC annual report brings together all the data that our members shared with us in September of last year. And we have some headline figures that we discussed in detail yesterday, but also it's part of our toolkit. This is where you have data, where you can use your company's data to benchmark how you are doing against companies of your size, in your region, in your sector within tech. So do have a look there. You'll also hear us mentioning our open playbook of best practice. This is where you go to get those tips on a number of strategies, whether that's retention, growth, retraining. It's also looking at, as we say today, more than just gender, around gender, ethnicity, disability, you name it, we're trying to put that in the open playbook. Some of you have joined are the TTC signatories already. Thank you. We're pleased to have you here. Some of you are new, not really thought about this yet. We would love to have you join. It is free to join. We are now 545 members, I think, signatories today, as of today. And what we want is more. This is how we bring together the sector to really drive change. What you'll find in the event, across the event, at the Charter, we don't take time to rehearse the why of inclusion and diversity. What we want to focus on is the how. If you are engaged, if you already know why and you want to know how to do it better, faster, with more impact, this is the place for you. If you go down on the page, you will see that this is how you can join the Tech Talent Charter, and we'd love to have you. And finally, you'll see at the bottom of the page, the sponsors that help us bring together the event as a whole this week. Now, joining is free, but we have a number of organizations that sponsor us, that make what we do possible and make what we do possible and free for anyone to use. So thank you for our sponsors. Today, when we look at both moving beyond gender, we have Unilever who's sponsoring the whole of the event, but HP is particularly wanting us, and Lloyd's Banking Group will be looking at ethnicity and social mobility today. So thanks to our sponsors. Enough housekeeping. Let's look at what we're going to be talking about today. If you know the Tech Talent Charter, you'll know back in 2017, what we promised was this was never going to be just about gender. Gender was our starting point, but it needed to be the entire piece of inclusion and diversity. And we knew by last year that we announced at last year's January event that our members had said they're ready to look wider. And the two areas that you told us that you were most interested in really making a difference were around ethnicity and social mobility. And so we've been working with our members across the last year, and oh, what a year it's been, to look at how we can make something different in that area. You will probably have heard yesterday that for the first time, as well as requiring our members to submit data on ethnicity, on gender, we are asking people to share ethnicity data. Last year, it was strongly encouraged, and I was delighted that 45% of our members shared that data. Now, we call this, the theme for this week is tough conversations and meaningful action. Now, when we talk about tough conversations, I'm delighted that we have 45% of our members that are sharing data. If you look as a whole at ethnicity and lump it all together as BAME, ethnicity for tech doesn't look too bad, but this is important. We believe that data matters, and we believe in unpacking data to uncover uncomfortable truths. And when we look at Black representation, it looks less good than what we're looking at ethnicity. And then in particular, working with partners on data, what we know, it's not just an issue of Black representation. It is about retention. It is about growth. It is about promotion. And we have some stats that show us we've got a long way to go. So today we will be looking at and unpacking what can employers do around Black representation. What can we do to make our ethnicity actions more impactful? And we'll be talking about how we continue to move the conversation on from just diversity, which is just a tick boxing exercise if that's all we do, through to inclusion. But the next step is the really meaningful one where we start talking about equity and we start talking about belonging. And so to hear more about that today, I want to kick off with a fireside conversation that I was able to have with Dr. Anne-Marie Imafidon. Now, many of you will know Anne-Marie. If you don't already, she is founder of the amazing Stemettes, a partner with us from the start. She has been named the most influential woman in UK IT last September. And I am proud to say she was one of the founding members of the Tech Talent Charter. I had a chance to sit down with Anne-Marie and really talk about what's happening in the space. Let's hear what we talked about. What I want us to do, let's start on the positive, and then we're going to lean into today the difficult conversations that need to happen for 2021. As you keep saying, after pandemic, after everything was sort of broken. But let's think back from 2010 until 2020. What, if anything, has improved in tech in terms of inclusion and diversity? Is there anything that we should feel pleased about when we think about computing?
Oh, is there anything to be pleased about? I think, so there's kind of two big things to be pleased about. I think the first thing is, the first step in solving a problem is admitting that you have one. And we can't take for granted, like you said, the conversations that were happening when I started Stemettes back in 2013. You know, there were some, really big players saying, why do you want to just do the girl thing? Or, why would you do that? Or all kinds of things that they were saying. There are still some industries that we at Stemettes, and we're STEM, so we're a little bit broader than the traditional tech. There are still some industries we work with that kind of only maybe just about perhaps warming up to the fact that there might be a problem that doesn't center with the problem is with the women, or they're just not interested. And so I think that's one big step that has been taken that we shouldn't take for granted. I think the other side is that the numbers have been going in a positive direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is something, again, I'm not saying it was all me, but, I started Stemettes with it being on the decline. There was a conference I was at in the States where they kind of said that it'd been in free fall for the last couple of years. And so I think we have to take a positive in that just before the pandemic hit, we were on this upward trend. Of course, the pandemic has shifted everything. You'll have seen all the research and everything says women have been hardest hit. That's the same across technology. It's the same for the younger women as well, and the kind of jobs that they were doing outside of technology. So I think the positives are we're moving in the right direction, and we are admitting that there is a problem.
And we're seeing that with our members, because if you think back when we were starting Tech Talent Chartered, and we had just 17 companies holding hands and saying we could do that, we rolled forward to now we're over 500 organizations who are sharing data. And I think what's positive is you're right that the data is getting marginally better, and we know for the Tech Talent Charter that we are marginally ahead of the rest of the sector. So we're facing the right direction. We've agreed there's a problem and we're trying to solve it. And what I'm excited about is seeing companies like we're seeing across these 3 days working together. And I think if we look back in 2019, our members were starting to say to us, because back when we first started, you remember that big debate on those early days for Tech Talent Charter out, is it gender? Is it more than gender? We had to say, to start with, we've got to have a focus, but with the commitment to go wider. And so, in 2019, before the world broke, to say that we were going to lean in and we were going to do more on ethnicity, to lean in and to say that we needed to look at things that are often hidden, like social mobility, to look and think about things like disability, was deeply important. And it put us in a stronger position for when the world broke. Because, I think there was, if you think of the last national event we had, was January of 2020, back in the days when we could all be in the same room, we could all hug each other. Exactly. And then 2020. And 2020, as you said, it broke a lot of things. A lot of people who'd made it on the ladder got kicked off. A lot of the assumptions that we had were brought into question.
A lot of budgets were slashed around this as well.
And then yet again, George Floyd and hashtag BLM reminded us that we can't just let this be about gender. We have to have those conversations. So, 2017 when we started was gender pay reporting, hashtag Me Too, Weinstein. And on the back of some of that crisis, we could move forward on gender. 2020, we had hashtag BLM, we had COVID, we have these things. So we're coming into 2020. You've now got hundreds and hundreds of people you're talking to today for lunch, and they know they're coming for a difficult conversation. If you can have a difficult conversation for us, for the business leaders, the tech leaders, what do we need to hear? What do we need to be talking about if we're really going to move the dial and make tech inclusive and diverse? What do you think?
So there's a few things to be talking about and to thinking about, and I think the main thing is just not just talking, which I think is it's easy to say educate yourself, and all the other things I will end up saying. It's easy to say educate yourself. It's easy to say read natives, read British, read why I don't talk to white people about race. So it's easy to read these things and educate. It's easy to talk. Talk is cheap. We had this, as you just said at the very beginning, we said it needs to have teeth, right? And I think even kind of the data you've ended up collecting across the TTC companies, it shows it having that intention, right? And I think we called it a slippery slope back then. It was kind of, if you start with the gender, there'll be a slippery slope to being inclusive. So I think with anyone that's listening, we have to act. We have to be acting with intent. And this is something I think I took from that table is, we have to intentionally include, otherwise we'll unintentionally exclude. And we have to be intentional now across, whether it's race, across the protected characteristics and beyond. And so I think my biggest message is, it's in the doing. All of this is in the doing. And it's actually in the small, much more than it's in the big, right? It's in the small of how are you, what are people's experiences when they're being recruited?
Yes.
It's in the, what are the jokes that you're making about who can come on, it's in the, what are the assumptions that you're making about different colleagues that you have. And I think, even the pandemic has been a really good opportunity to say, you're now looking into people's homes or not, right? And so there's a lot of things that we kind of used to assume, and we used to be like, everyone must, and now it's like, well, no, there's no must in being in the office. And there hasn't been for a while. And this is something you could have done beforehand, but it's in the actions. And so I think it's quite important, anytime you are educating, any discussions you are having, always think about what's the new habit that we can pick up as an organization. And on that, there's been lots of discussions and lots of things, lots of people to talk to. Hustle Crew, I definitely point people in the direction of YSYS. But I think it's also allowing it to be in the small, in the same way that we spell check all of our documents. How are we belonging checking? How do we do a belonging check on our actions?
Oh, we're going to use that as a technique. That's a key phrase, belonging checking our documents. Because you've talked really persuasively about the issue of belonging. And I think that is, when we first started, we were letting people just talk about diversity. And then about 18 months in, we started saying, well, actually, we need to move that conversation, talk about inclusion, which can lead to diversity. And what I've loved now is this evolution of saying, okay, belonging. So if I'm new to the party and I'm going, belonging checking, what is this phrase I know not of? Walk me through, what does that mean?
So it's the journey, and I think it's great because it's diversity, it's inclusion, it's belonging, and it's equity or equitable practice. Yes. I think is the kind of the logical conclusion. And the way that I describe it is, diversity is just having the different people there, right? Having a load of women in the room doesn't mean that when you decide to add a period tracker to your product, just having them there doesn't mean that that is going to end up being a successful feature, as tech company X discovered when they discovered periods 2 years ago, added it in, and then it ended up only tracking 10 days, which if you're someone who's ever had a period or ever met anyone that's had a period, right? And you've got to think they had women in the room, they didn't hear from them. So diversity is just them being in the room, which isn't really how you unlock this business case for diversity we're always banging on about. Inclusion means you're including them as part of the discussion, right? So maybe they said something, you included them in the discussion, right? And they felt it's somewhat included, but you still managed to get that feature out because you included them in the discussion. But if you don't listen to them, if they're not able to verbally say,
there's mansplaining that follows through, that doesn't,
right? And so belonging is, you have those people, you have different types of people around the table, and they belong enough where it's not just about you listening to them or including them, but sometimes they're leading the conversation, but also they feel comfortable enough, or they know that they've been heard, or that you de-risk their interactions with you and their contributions to what's going on.
And I think that's so important because we're hearing, and I think it's on all sides of the table. And it's why I think belonging is such a powerful concept, because it moves away from the zero-sum game. White, middle-aged, middle-class man bad, everyone else good. Belonging is everyone at the table, and it's de-risking. A lot of our companies are talking about creating the safe spaces.
Exactly.
To get it wrong, to ask the question, to say the incorrect thing, the willingness to learn and be educated along that piece, and it's empowering the voices in the room. And I think but then building in the little habits, but the little habits to turn into big habits.
Yes, and to turn into culture, because this has always been a problem of culture, right? And culture is your languages, culture is your norms. And so if you're moving those norms and you're allowing more people to feel like they belong, then that is the ultimate. That's where you're heading towards. And I think it is important, even talking about safe spaces, there are some people, you shouldn't always need a safe space, right? Needing a safe space is the same as needing a quota. It's you admitting that there's something wrong in the regular space. That's why a safe space is needing. Quota is the same thing, right? We said this right at the beginning. You having a quota is you admitting that the system at the moment doesn't work. That's why you literally have to crowbar people in that should have been there in the first place. And so it's quite important for companies to look at what are we actually aiming for? Because I think we also got caught up in diversity is all that we're looking for. And it's like, no. Belonging is what we're looking for. Diversity and inclusion is fine. That's just the first step, right? The petrol station isn't where you're going. You just needed it to be able to get to where you wanted to be. And exactly. And I think the other side of it is equity, which I think has been the thing people have struggled with this whole time. I think there's something, yes, equality is important, but actually we're not living in a vacuum. You know, life didn't just start now. And so we do have to take on the fact that different people need different, you know, there's that cartoon you have of people stood on different height boxes to see the baseball game. And it's understanding that people do need different things to be able to access what's going on. And you're not giving them difference because it's preference, or you're not giving them difference because they're not a white man, but you're giving them what they need to be able to access whatever's happening here in the workplace. And I think if we think about belonging, you know, I always say to companies when I talk to them, think about to individuals, you know, think about the last time you didn't belong, right? What was it about? What had happened that you didn't feel like you belonged? And you know, if you've never felt like you didn't belong, that says a lot about you know, the places you've been, you know, the privilege. It says a lot about your privilege as well.
Yeah.
And so it's quite important for people to understand that, you know, different people need different things to belong, but that's not something we hold against that. We just do that because you want the person to know that they belong. And so if you're heading for belonging, then you're definitely going to end up at the correct destination, or at the destination, which was
but it's again the difficult conversations, because we need to talk to people to understand what they need, not what we decided they need. This is about, when we're looking at underrepresented groups, hearing their experience and hearing what they want, and not making the damn assumption that if Anne-Marie, you tell me what you need, I therefore know what every Black person needs. You know, it is one of those things. And I think it happens again when we've lost sight of the ultimate purpose, or we're trying to rush things. We want to quick. I don't have much time. So Anne-Marie, speak on behalf of all. We were all in this room back in the time of Debbie. What is it that women
What do women need? Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So it's really starting to empower those individual voices, and to understand that in looking at that equity, in looking at that different mindset, it also opens up the doors for a lot of people. You know, as we've talked about gender, we've unlocked for a lot of men the space to let them talk about toxic masculinity.
Exactly. Yeah.
To talk about the price tag on mental health and the pressure that they're feeling.
Exactly.
And I do think it is, and it's where I sort of put myself forward. I have worked in gender, but I've needed to walk the journey of learning on ethnicity, because I can't pretend to know that lived experience. And so I have to be willing. We talk about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have to be able to go into rooms where I will feel like the odd person out, and I don't know, and I'm worried I'm going to get it wrong, and get it wrong sometimes, and be told you got it wrong.
And I think that's it as companies. I think that's the other thing that, you know, we, as a company, your default is, because of PR, because of whatever it is, that, you know, what you do is what you do, whatever you say is final, that is the end. And I think with something like this, you know, we've all got it wrong. We live in the patriarchy, we live with the systemic racism. And so it's not going to be something that overnight, or that you can just make one correct decision. But think about culture is the small, right? You can't just make one big decision and then magically you've got it all right. And so I think we also need to say, okay, and we have to be ready to hold our hands up, and we have to admit, and we have to also know that this is an evolution. As with any IT project, this is iterative, right? Over time.
It should be the one thing we know how to do. Yeah,
right.
We can't do D&I waterfall. This is an iterative process.
Exactly what it is, right? There's a new Facebook app out every 2 weeks, and that's Facebook, for goodness sake, right? And so this is something that's on a completely different scale. But again, we have to say we will get it wrong. We'll get it wrong because people are different. We'll get it wrong because life is evolving. We'll get it wrong because society is evolving. And so what we'll do is be open about getting it wrong, but we're always seeing to have that growth mindset, always seeing to get better. And then it means that people, again, are more likely to feel like they belong, or more willing to maybe be a part of that process of getting better if they know. But what you can't do, which we've seen kind of on the global stage, is say, no, enough is enough. You've had enough talking about this Black thing now. You're not, you know, it's not it, or this isn't scientific, or we're going to reject this paper. Out. We've heard too much. It's like, no. We have to, you know, we have to continue. We have to be, it's going to be tiring. And I think, you know, for anyone that is thinking this is going to be really uncomfortable, you have to think, the people that don't belong, how uncomfortable is it for them?
Exactly.
And will you ever get to that level? Should you ever aspire to get to that level of being uncomfortable and not belonging? No, but you should be working in the small, we pre-recorded this, right? You don't know what else is going on in my life. And so we've been comfortable. It doesn't have to be live. Some bits will be live, some bits won't. And so I think it's you can't take all the assumptions, but I think being aware of those differences means that you can kind of plan for a breadth of ways of working, or a breadth of opinions, or a breadth of skill sets, or a breadth of people. And so I think it's all a learning process. It's all iterative. You're aiming to get more people to feel like they belong, and that's where you're heading.
So in SMEs and startups, there's a lot of time, and we have some surveys in our recent report that's talking about the number of men who are uncomfortable to say anything because they're fearful of getting it wrong and moving past that. And for, like you said, for corporates, you've got to get rid of the sense of perfection. This can't be polished and made perfect. It is that growth mindset that we need to take and move forward on the macro, as well as from that micro, in terms of doing that. And then anything else that because we are looking beyond that, beyond ethnicity, we also have to think about things like social inclusion. We need to start opening our eyes and thinking about, what are we doing about disability? How are we opening doors and really making ourselves inclusive for neurodiversity? For you, what you're seeing, is there anything else that you need people to say? Difficult conversation and meaningful action. What else do you want to say to our audience?
So I think the only other the kind of main thing, so I mean, to labour the point just one more time, this will be turbulent. I think there's you're pushing against something pretty bigger than you are, bigger than the industry, kind of longer standing than the industry is. And you're pushing against some fairly intentional things that have been done as well by our predecessors. The Mahik's book, Programmed Inequality, is great on this. Invisible Women also kind of shows So it's going to be hard. I kept reading Invisible Women for long. I used to, when I could only read a chapter, and then I'd have to stop around the house because I'd be so cross for an hour. Caroline feels the same way whenever it gets relived in front of her. But I think so. It's quite. So you have to remember there's going to be turbulence. But I think the other thing is that you always want to be listening. You always want to be listening. You always want to be hearing out. You always want to be ready to look for the difference and be planning for the difference. And I think with the pandemic, the other thing we've seen has been you're a whole human being. Your employees are entire human beings. It used to be that they'd come to the office, they'd leave all of that behind, and now they can't. Yeah. And I think it's going to be really important to say, okay, cool. If we get gender, if we get ethnicity, if we get disability, if we get LGBT, if we get neurodiversity, people are still different. So we have to be ready to take on this difference and to be flexible and to be open. Because it's always been middle-aged man with a housewife. It's always been that. It was geared up for that. That was what it was planned for. The breadth of human beings we have means that was never that barely worked for the middle-aged man with the housewife, because not all of them were the same. And so I think it's going to be really important for companies to say, is it really easy to take the 9 or the 7 or however many protected characteristics you have where you are, but how are you open to that difference? How are you opening as many different doors as you can?
And to build on that, I think, Anne-Marie, we could have had that conversation last January. But what I'd say is what COVID has done, and COVID mixed with a healthy mix of Brexit, etc., is it has exploded those differences. And so I think even a lot of the old rules, the old ways of doing things for white middle-class men with housewives have been broken.
Now, they have, but they haven't, which I think is that's why it's another thing to think about is, you still don't have, it's an article that came out this morning. There's another one that came out this morning saying women have been hardest hit because of the new round of homeschooling. They're 9 times more likely, all these things. And it's like, okay, it was broken. We already knew it was broken. This has accelerated it being broken. We can't take for granted that coming out of this, because we now know everything will magically be changed. And so I think it's been really important for companies, you lean on the playbook as much as you can, but also go beyond and say, what are we doing around care? What are we doing around unpaid labour? What are we doing around the things that people do outside, and the fact that they're an entire human being? And being a carer isn't necessarily a protected characteristic. Right?
Exactly. But I think there was also some research I was seeing that was suggesting that perhaps during COVID, yes, women were hardest hit, and they always have been. But they think within the UK that potentially this could represent one of the biggest social shifts that we've had since World War II, in that while women still have the majority, there is a larger percentage of men taking on a larger percentage of domestic duties within the house. And what's exciting about it is I'm hearing more and more men say, and actually, I don't want to go back to the old way of doing it. And I definitely hear some women saying, we're not going back to the old way. So it is a point at which we need to remember the tendency of systems to revert back. All right. And I think for 2021, it's looking across, everything got blown up and thrown in the air. You know, I love Churchill's never waste a good crisis. Before people get in and start building the same systems, building the same structures, let's get in, because we've shown things that work. Yeah. And I hate the idea of building back better and the new normal, but that's what we need to do. For people on this call, we have companies, we have individuals, we have senior teams who get it. And they're starting to realize that getting it is going to give them the advantage.
Yep.
And in doing that, the building back better, thinking of care, thinking that care all of us are going to take on, because it's not just kids. We've got an aging population. My daughter better start getting ready to look after me.
Yep.
And it's the companies who lean in to get this right are going to find, they're going to keep, they're going to grow the best talent and create the best services.
Yeah.
Anne-Marie, when we can do this face to face and it ends with a big hug, I will be a much happier bunny. But while we do this, I know you promised, you've got this exciting project we're talking about. Are we talking more about it?
Yeah, we're talking about it now. I mean, okay. It's Tuesday and I'm behind on it, but it will get done. So I've got a new book coming out. So it's a 2-book deal, actually. But the first one is called She's in Control, and the second one is as yet untitled. But I think the other thing we didn't touch on, but I think is definitely when we talk about accelerated tech trends because of the pandemic, I think the future of work is something I've been obsessed with for ages, and something I've ended up talking about, thinking about, deliberating on because of the young women and the young people that we work with, or I work with at Stemettes. And so with the book, I think it's this whole thing of we need to be continuously learning. Like all of us need to be doing that, whether it's technical things, which we already know, or whether it's things outside of that, but trying to bring on anyone that thinks that they're tech illiterate or thinks that they're not techie or not technical to kind of dare to dream. And as the title suggests, it's focused at the untechnical woman. But also looking at a kind of, there's so much to be done. There's so much that periods is just one example of where we've got a lot of catching up to do on women exist and on a niche. And so we might want to reflect that in some of the decisions we make about technology.
And we're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere.
We're not. We probably gave birth to you. And so, it's one of those things that we have, there's a lot that the industry needs to do. But actually, before the industry changes, we can't wait. And so there's a lot that we can do to kind of gather as women. And so I think for me, the book is almost my version of, if anyone's seen the film Hidden Figures, when she kind of goes and grabs the Python book from the local library and is like, ladies, these computers are going to come and take our jobs because they were computers at NASA. This is my kind of equivalent of, okay, look, like, let's not assume that dystopia is where we're going to end up. It could be better. Just by virtue of being a woman that's looking at some kind of technology, there's a lot that you can add because we've not really been heard or listened to, and there's a rich herstory of technical women. So it touches on a lot of these different themes, but the idea is it's something you buy and you give to the woman in your life who isn't necessarily technical, or it's something you read and you use that to bring in others, because it's been too long us assuming that because we're technical we know everything and we can build everything for everybody. I think the time for that has gone. There's so much that we've seen that's gone wrong as a result of that one-sided perspective.
And I think so much is changing now across that whole of the pipeline. And so anyone on the call, if you don't know it already, Tech Talent Charter, yes, we're focusing on the tech workforce. But we work with partners like the Institute of Coding, TechSheCan, and Future.now that look at that wider pipeline. How are we helping get those skills for people who need it in the workplace? What are we doing to reach into schools? How can we rethink and reimagine what happens in universities? And then also this idea, we had the Doing It Anyway campaign where we looked at the range of women who weren't in tech and found their way in, and the companies who are doing that. So anyone who's listening to this and want to find out more about that on Friday, that'll be the day to hear more about those. But listen, I can't wait for the book. Thank you for coming out of hiding to do this. I really appreciate it. And once it comes out, let's get back together again, and you can tell us some more.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here on the second day of the TTC Festival, and I'm really excited about the panel discussion that we're going to have today. Before we do that, I just want to remind each and every one of you that we are really keen on making sure that we're continuing to have this conversation across social. So please do use hashtag TTC 2021 and at Tech Charter UK to continue to share your thoughts, perspectives and views as we're going through the conversations today. I also want to just remind, before I kickstart, to say please do submit your questions for Q&A towards the end of this session. To kickstart, my name is Edleen John. For those of you who don't know me, I am very, very honoured and very privileged to be one of the directors of Tech Talent Charter. That is what I like to call my side job. And in my day job, I am the International Relations, Corporate Affairs and co-partner for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the Football Association. But today is not about me. Today is about me just being a vessel to hear the thoughts, perspectives and views from our fantastic panel today. So with that, I am going to kickstart by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And so Sandra, if I could start with you, that would be fantastic.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Sandra Kerr and I'm the Race Equality Director, Business in the Community. We work with employers from the public and private sector who know that actually race equality is good for UK, good for the economy. And if we're actually going to build back better, we need to build back inclusively. So great to be here today.
Fantastic. And Stephen, if we could go to you next.
Hi, Edleen. Great to see you. Hi, Sandra. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Stephen Frost. I'm CEO of FOST Included. We work across sectors on diversity inclusion work, helping leaders embed inclusion in their decision making. I written a few books, teach in a few business schools, try and get folks to think about inclusion as a core part of leadership before they become big bad CEOs, and consult with folks around the world. Great to be here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. And Sasha?
Hello, my name is Sasha Mills, everyone. I'm Executive Director at the Bank of England. I'm also within the bank. I've been joint co-executive sponsor of our BAME network and our task force for BAME. Really key part of the bank's mission to make sure that we reflect the population that we serve. And so attracting, retaining and progressing BAME colleagues, making everyone feel really at home is a key direction for us. So really looking forward to this discussion and to learn and share with others.
Brilliant, fantastic. Last but not least, Rachel.
Hi there, thanks everyone for having me. My name is Rachel Edwards. I'm HRBP for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Atos. We're passionate about diversity and inclusion, and I've been leading on the strategy for the last couple of years, and also chairing our Diversity and Inclusion Steering Committee, which is made up of 7 diversity networks and all of their co-chairs. So it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about a topic that I'm really passionate about, and Atos has really been trying very hard to drive the last couple of years.
Brilliant, fantastic, thank you. So today we want to talk about having difficult conversations, and I want to kickstart by going to Sandra first. Obviously, Sandra, in your role leading the charge as it relates to this work at BITC, this is absolutely something that you are not new to and have been doing for an extended period of time. And of course, we've worked together for a number of years now as well. But I wanted to get your thoughts around what is it that you think changed after the murder of George Floyd last year, and how did you see the sentiment and feeling really navigate in a slightly different way from what had happened before?
Yeah, so, good question. So what I saw, and I, clearly, so the pandemic hit, we had, one of the things that we have been promoting at BITC is the Race at Work Charter. So we had 250 organizations, the pandemic hit, and then for the first time, I think March, we had about 1 organization sign up. And then there were like maybe 2 in April, and then we had the killing of George Floyd, which literally, I think because people saw it on television prior to that, They had begun to see the disparities that were being thrown up about people in frontline services from ethnic minority backgrounds more likely to have contagion and death. And seeing that just really triggered the challenges that in the UK, the challenges with the criminal justice system, Lamy Review and other things have spotlighted this in the past. And then individuals starting to talk about what it's like at work and what their lived experience has been. So what I have seen is, number one, we had, as I say, 250. We now have more than 600 organizations signed up to the Race at Work Charter. We also put out an infographic on Windrush Day that flagged that actually Black representation, when you looked at be it the judiciary, policing, education, business, was 1%, when really it should be closer to 3%. And that was a revisited report. We'd already flagged this in 2014, and in 2020, we're seeing not much change. And then also the other area where we've seen organizations wanting to do more is actually really deaggregating data to examine where is the Black representation at different levels in the organization. I did a blog post and the Black Voices report, which looked at leadership at top table, allyship being really important, and then also listening to your employees who help you to connect with communities who are often in the behind the queue. And what we have seen, not only more employers sign up, more employers attending webinars, asking for bespoke support to help with action plans. And I've spoken to a lot of executive teams across corporates and leaders saying, we want to be accountable for this. We are setting targets, we are taking action, and we want you as our employees to hold us to account.
Thank you, Sandra. So I suppose moving on from what you've just shared there, I'd like to go to Stephen next. And I suppose I want to pose the question. Sandra's talked about an awakening and a moment that happened whereby clearly organizations were beginning to say, this is something we need to focus on and we need to do some work in this space. Stephen, as an employer or sitting within a position in an organization where you're thinking, right, I need to focus on this agenda, where do you start? What is the importance of data in this space? And what should be some of the first steps you might look to take?
No, thanks, Adeline. I think, so much, but I think from a data perspective, there's really three things. One, I guess, is diversity, right? Representation. I speak to you as a privileged white guy, right? Hopefully an ally, but there's a lot of folks like me in tech, right? And so I think looking at actually the data itself, because it's only when you actually understand representation, you see it in black and white, that you kind of get it. So Sandra can reel off some amazing facts, right? But it's only when academics realize that less than 1% of professors are actually Black that you go, wow, okay. So one is the data and the representation. Going beyond the protect characteristics to look at also cognitive diversity, socioeconomic as well, getting that baseline. The second is then projecting it, right? So it's great that we've got a baseline and we now acknowledge the problem, but what's it going to look like in 1, 3, 5 years' time? And just building on Sandra's point, right? Until really we saw a groundswell of kind of almost white awakening last year around Black Lives Matter, we hadn't really seen a shift in numbers for a decade plus. And so actually we need to project it forwards. When organizations realize that, being aware of the problem isn't going to solve the problem, and just having great intentions isn't going to kind of solve it, you realize that actually unless you consciously do stuff, you often get less diverse over time. And you can talk about that in tech and startups and so forth, that people are all progressive and want to do great stuff, but you keep kind of hiring in your own image and you actually get less diverse. So you need to project it and then you can course correct it. And the third thing you need to do is really measure inclusion, which gives you then an insight into kind of ultimately belonging, right? And that you can have the baseline, you can project the data, but unless you actually know what are the key behaviors that you need to act on that are going to contribute to or detract from inclusion, you're never going to get an inclusive environment where people belong. And therefore, you're not going to have that diversity representation be sustainable in the long term.
Great. And to build on that, one of the points that Sandra referenced earlier and talked about as it relates specifically to that data point is the deaggregation of data and understanding things in more depth. Rachel, I wonder if you could give us a bit of insight into the work that's happened at Atos in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. If specifically around data, we had to take quite an important lens at this because we made a commitment last year to really drive an increase in data declaration. we already had reasonably good data declaration, and we were planning to do ethnicity pay gap reporting for 2020 for the first time, but we realised that in order for that to be really effective, we had to make sure that we had it higher. So one of the things we did was we took a really big look at where it was in the business that we were struggling for data, because I kind of saw it as there was potentially two reasons we might have a lack of data. One could be trust, if your employees didn't feel that they were comfortable to declare, but the other one potentially would be around systems. So was it physically possible for employees to declare, or has it been easy for them? So when we broke that down, it was really interesting to see that quite a large percentage of the people that hadn't declared were actually sitting in one particular business area, and it turned out that it was a part of the business that had chupied across to us, and possibly just we hadn't brought their data with them, or they hadn't had it at their previous organization. So as a result, we had to really target that area and drive diversity and in terms of the declaration, ask them those questions specifically. And on doing that, we also identified that they were struggling to access the system that we did declaration on, because they had particular security requirements that meant they had limited access to our laptops, and they were using client laptops a lot. So as a result, we created a slightly different system that was much easier for them, and we dramatically increased their data. We're now at about 85% declaration across the business, which is really fantastic when you think about that kind of 1 year progression. And when you can then look at that, we've also got a really advanced data analytics team that have created a really good diversity dashboard for me, and that allows me to then kind of look at different areas of the business and identify challenges or differing areas of diversity in a more broken down sense as well. So that's been really useful and really helped us drive the declaration up by properly understanding why we didn't have the data as high as we wanted it to.
That's really helpful. And Sandra, I'd like to come to you next, just to understand some of the other reasons why it might be that organizations could struggle to get this type of data from their people.
Yeah, no, Idlin, I think there's a huge thing around trust. So at the beginning is why. So if you're an organization who's never talked about race or ethnicity, and suddenly you're like, I want your ethnicity, I want lots of kind of information about you, employers can be a bit skeptical. I think one of the key things is always transparency. So frequently asked questions. So start to compile what are the common comments and questions that people are asking, and respond to them and be really transparent about them, even if it means putting an FAQ on your intranet so everyone can kind of have a look at it and see what is going to happen to the data, who's going to hold it, and use the opportunity to demonstrate what good works you've done on gender. So most employers have done something on gender. Why? Because the data is easy to access and they can see where representation needs kind of intervention. And by kind of showcasing that you're an employer, that when you get data and insight, you actually do something positive with that enables you to build that trust. And then also think about who's giving the messages. You need that commitment from the top table. They must have the stomach for it to say, right, let's go. And then also think about managers at different levels, trade unions, network leads, people we trust, different people in the organization who can all kind of be giving the message that this really matters. We can't kind of begin to really look at what actions we need to take in the most impactful way if we're kind of operating in the dark. And then also just a simple thing that some employers do, and there is a, you have to keep asking, but some even, offer to donate to the charity of an individual's choice to kind of persuade those who actually, just haven't got around to it. But that's a little bit of a motivator.
That's really helpful. And Sasha, I'd like to come to you to talk a little bit about some of the challenges around collecting ethnicity data within organizations and what small and large companies might think about as it relates to overcoming some of those challenges.
Thank you, Edeline. And I think for the Bank of England, we're obviously a large organisation, a very data-driven organisation, which in a way makes it slightly surprising how long it has taken us to get to the point of being able to analyse the data. This discussion is very much about providing the trust for people to give that data. We've been through that curve. I think a lot of that's tone from the top. I can talk a little bit about a review that we're doing later on. But once you've got that data, there's really quite a big challenge about how granular it is. Because if you want to evidence progress and try to evaluate some of the initiatives that you've got in place, and obviously a really big theme about not just talking about it and saying it's the right thing to do and people can kind of align behind that, but actually changing actions and evaluating the outcomes, which all the different initiatives are going to be really effective for ensuring both that people want to join your organisation, they want to stay, they get fairly promoted, these types of things. You need pretty good and quite granular data. And we found that when you get to a certain level of granularity, then you have the personal, identifying, you can't keep it anonymous. And that's an area that we're certainly giving a lot of thought on at the moment, because we absolutely want to change ideas into action and evaluate whether that's happening. So there's a mixture, I think, here between what we've always been discussing, the tone to the top. People need to feel that it's safe to share the data. It's not just out of nowhere and not used in a right way, but they can see the value of that. And I think, to be honest, that's a challenge we're working with now. I think the fact that our most senior committee, our governing body, has said very clearly in its review post the George Floyd events that we really want to look back at whether we are doing enough evaluating how we can support BAME colleagues and ensure progression and make everybody feel at home, welcome and part of the organisation. That is important, but we have to not hold back from difficult discussions, and people want to do that on the basis of data, quite rightly, but there's this slight tension with protecting individuals' identity, especially when you get into things like pay, progression and reward. So I just thought I'd set that out as a frontier that we're grappling with at the moment, and no doubt other organisations are. That's a perspective from a large firm. I imagine from a smaller business, it's even harder to look at the data without breaches of privacy. So that's what.
So talking about some of those challenges as it relates to size of organisation and making sure that people are not identifiable, one of the reasons or rationale that has been given by some companies around why they look at not deaggregating the data is saying, actually, from a numbers perspective, we don't have sufficient representation. But I'm very conscious that today is all about difficult discussions. And one of the key areas of difficult discussions in this space is the correct and appropriate terminology. So we have seen a shift change with some being vocal about the importance of being specific around the ethnic groups we're talking about versus putting people under an umbrella of BAME. Sandra, I'm really keen to get your thoughts on this area, because I know it's an area that BITC have done some work in and want us to kind of tackle it head on today.
Absolutely, it's interesting. So I tried to resolve this challenge in 2015 with our Race at Work survey, where I asked, individuals, particularly ethnic minority individuals, what terminology do you want to use? And of the ones that exist, I mean, a third of people said, look, I don't really care about that. And ethnicity, so ethnic minority came out first. BAME, Black Asian Minority Ethnic, came out second. BME, Black Minority Ethnic, and then people of color came out fourth. I think where we are now is a perception, and potentially I've heard people kind of almost confessing as well, that BAME, Black Asian Minority Ethnic, has been used to mask the non-inclusion of Black people. So saying BAME, but whilst knowing that actually we've only got one Black partner or one Black manager. Hence why people are like, that is not a term that is helpful. It's not a term that's authentic or honest. We are going to run the survey again. Actually, I'm opening it again on the 22nd of March. That question will be in there along with new terms that are emerging. So open to any new terms that anyone else has got that we can test to see what's different. But one of the things is actually saying Black, spelling it out. But we know the terminology Black, if you look at Asian, they all have complexities, which is why we do encourage that when you're tracking data and collecting data, you use the census categories, because at least then you can benchmark what's happening with your workplace with labour market stats. But I think the debate continues on this, because people who, when it comes to terminology, if someone hates BAME, they really do hate it. It does matter. But I think we only need to really worry about it if we're talking about it in a public forum, or if we're going to write about it, because other than that, you can just call people by their names. But we do need to get to language, and I would say use the census categories when you're looking at data and looking at disparities.
Thank you. Stephen, again, in your work that you've done across different organisations, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on that piece that Sandra just mentioned, and how it is that organisations are looking to overcome that challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Adelaide. I mean, like, look, I think this is a critical discussion to have. I think for me, one thing I've learned very recently, actually, is that when we say data, we often jump to quant data. And I think quant data is really, really important, right? The numbers don't lie. We can really get involved in that. And I think, as far as we can protect anonymity, let's say, guidelines of 11 people to protect anonymity and so forth and so forth. Let's drill down into the most micro we can to expose, as Sandra said, the potential, ignoring the fact that there are some patterns within ethnic minorities that really need addressing. But one thing I've learned is that in addition to that, we shouldn't underestimate the qualitative. So recently, a lot of things we've been doing with colleagues and clients has been focused on listening groups, focus groups, and there we can kind of really genuinely have those difficult conversations, because you can literally put it out there to the entire organization. Right, we'd like to have focus groups and listening groups. They can be a randomized sample, a randomized controlled trial. But ultimately, you could say, well, if you would like a safe space, we can create one for you. So then you actually get Black staff telling you that, no, we'd appreciate actually a Black focus group. Okay, great. So then you can actually kind of hear from people rather than make assumptions, have those very in-depth conversations with, strong external facilitation to get out real lived testimony. And that can then give you tremendous insights. So I think the combination of the qual plus the quant is really important to get a true sense of what's going on and to make it abundantly clear to people what the challenge is, right? Because ultimately, you can't ignore someone's lived testimony. And if these are the words that people are saying, you'd be well informed to take notice of them. So that's one thing, Adeline, we're seeing.
That's really helpful, Stephen. And talking about that creation of a safe space, I suppose a question that I want to throw out to the group is, what does a psychologically safe space look like? We've just heard in the video from Anne-Marie prior that actually, is it that organizations only have those safe spaces when the broader space isn't safe? But I'm keen to know, what does a psychologically safe space look like to have some of these difficult conversations? And how can you use that psychologically safe space to drive action? Rachel, I want to come to you first on this one.
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of things I think around this. So we did quite a lot of work on safe spaces in the last year or so as we were driving forward our ethnicity action pledge that we made in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. There was a couple of things that I think is interesting. One, we very much engaged our cultural diversity network, the Together network. They're a huge part of our diversity strategy when it comes to ethnicity at Atos, and they actually hosted the safe spaces. So I thought it was important that colleagues had the opportunity to go to these safe spaces and talk about actually what do they want us to see, what do they want to see us take action on, and how would they feel about certain different types of actions that we would take to address the disproportionate senior leadership and try and make sure we had proportional representation of ethnic minorities. So by giving them a chance to have a conversation in a space with kind of colleagues that were from minority ethnic backgrounds as well, I feel like with me listening in, it was also that kind of way that they could talk to people who really understood where they were coming from. So we did that for kind of the cultural network side of things. But what we also did was we ran ally race sessions. So I want to pick up on something that I think Stephen was talking about, which is, and all around the discussion about terminology, is that there are colleagues that are struggling to talk about race, and actually that they are allies, but they don't know how to talk about race and they don't know how to demonstrate that necessarily, and it's scary for them, and actually what's really important, I think, is that they are empowered to talk about these topics. So another area of safe spaces that we ran was we hosted ally sessions around race, where we talked about terminology and we discussed the different types of challenges and things that were faced by people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And by doing that in a really safe environment, we allowed people to explore the way that they could articulate how they felt about this stuff. So I think you've got to take a multiple pronged approach to all of this stuff and not just think that one size fits all for all of your colleagues. And we've got such a range of people in our business, it was important for us to think about different approaches. And that went really well, actually. And it was really nice as well, because I think there's an important part of of this whole piece about understanding the individual level of comfort to some actions around race. So through those safe spaces, we were really able to pick that out and make sure that we were informing our strategy appropriately and in a way that was going to land well with our colleagues. So those worked really effectively for us from a safe space perspective.
Thanks, Sasha. Thanks, Rachel. And now I want to go on to Sasha to hear your view on some of the work that you might have done at the Bank of England around this safe space piece.
Thank you, Eddie. And I think the important thing to say is these, I think, only work if the tone from the top is setting that background for safety. I think, as we've been discussing this morning, there's so many different dimensions to this that it's really key that people feel that they can speak up in a safe way, and then other people don't know how to, which language to use, these type of issues. And we actually have run a couple of sessions here. Let's talk about race. We used our BAME network. I'm conscious I'm using terminology, but we'll go with that for the moment. To actually engage with, starting with our senior staff, and then we worked out it's absolutely critical for that to permeate throughout the organisation, because you ended up with a layer of population who felt that they at least could attempt some better conversations about race, some difficult conversations, which language, but a safe space to say, can I say this? Is this appropriate? Because people are frightened to engage in the difficult conversation because they don't want to make a mistake. So empowering people to say, well, you might not get it right, but you need, by endeavouring to start the conversation, it's not going to feel comfortable. You will get it wrong, and then we'll move on. So we had run a whole set of those safe spaces. So by the senior people going first, it's then to reassure the next group down and cascade. And then we have a network of diversity and inclusion across the whole range of those issues. And using those championship teams, we've run a whole range of different "is it okay to" sessions. So very much making it really clear that everything discussed in those four walls is private within that group, that people can then literally ask the question they've always wanted to ask, which will help them get over it. We've had some great intersectionality examples there. We were talking about natural hair. There was a connection between women in the bank and the BAME group, and working and talking about those issues. How difficult is that as to how to present yourself? All the associations that are really, really difficult for different people's lived experience. And by starting those conversations and people opening up, I think that has helped to at least progress some of the awareness. So I think just calling it what it is in that sense, let's talk about race, is it okay? That keeping it quite simple like that perhaps helps to unlock, and everybody getting involved. I think role modelling is important there.
That's really helpful, Sasha. And what I'd like to do is to go to Sandra next, because what I want to focus on a little bit is how do we take some of the elements of that psychologically safe space and turn that into action within organisations? So how do we move from the listening and the taking on board perspectives to driving change across the action sphere within organisations?
So the safe space needs to be a space where people can challenge and actually share their story and call out behaviours or actions that aren't helpful without judgment, without it being career death. Yeah. So that's why sometimes people just stuff it down, or it's just too boring. You just think, I can't, it's exhausting and it's not going to go anywhere. So I think the bits around leaders, not just talking accountability, but the metrics and the evidence that says, look, we are going to, an advisory group, maybe to keep tracking progress on whatever the goals are. I'm going to use 2 bits of data from the Black Voices report as examples with what employers can do then. So one of the things that we asked in the Race at Work survey was, what do you think is going to be a career blocker? Multiple choice, 33% of Black respondents said their ethnicity, compared to 1% of white respondents. So think about it, 33% versus 1%. So imagine living in a world where ethnicity is not a thing, never have to think about it, compared to where it does. So one of the things employers can do is ensure you've got diverse people as part of those interview selection panels, as part of the sifting panels, and ensuring that you're tracking the kind of progression of applicants at every single stage, de-aggregating to see what's happening, and then putting in towards interventions as to what will you do should there be a disproportionate dropout. So that is one practical action based on evidence. The second big data point that we found was when we asked about, do you believe you get credit for your work? 49% of Black respondents says yes, compared to 57% of all other respondents across all ethnicity groups, 49% versus 57%. And then back to when I'm talking about the lack of representation at the top table. So using that insight, then it's consciously saying actually inclusive leadership rather than just I've had my sheep dig pop training. How are we going to check that that's really working? One of the ways is ensuring that the ideas or contributions are correctly attributed to the right person, and that the measures using employee surveys and using data as to progress talent pipeline, data's on promotion and selection panels and who gets those opportunities, who gets access to training, able to really check that it's working. So those are two things, practical things based on evidence that there is a disparity. And I'll just throw one more in. When we ask people, do you feel like you're included? Again, there was a disparity, 66% of Black employees saying yes compared to 71%. So there is something about that inclusion, that belonging, that voice, and you can measure that through 360-degree feedback and through employee survey testing to check that people are really feeling like they belong.
Thank you, Sandra. So Stephen, I'm going to come to you next. Following on from what Sandra's just said, what key actions can be taken to make sure that workplaces are inclusive for Black colleagues?
Yeah, no, thanks, Emily. I think, so we're at a really important moment, right? Because often this conversation that we're having is not being had by people who really need to have it. And we're at risk of having a polarized workforce, right, reflecting polarized society. So I think it's quite urgent that we check that and build towards more inclusion, which means getting people involved and giving them concrete things that they can do. And for me, at the Bank of England, Sasha will note that one concrete thing that came from the data was we could quantify the difference in psychological safety between Black women and white men. And when you literally see it as a coefficient, you know, economists can understand, oh, that's not good. And we can directly intervene in the behaviors which were to do with transparency of decision-making, leadership behaviors, network connectivity, and set up a sponsorship program, set up reverse mentoring, things to actually directly intervene where it's going to have most impact, most bang for your buck. So I think the sponsorship program at the Bank of England is one very concrete example of something that's definitely had demonstrable effects. And you've seen, you know, increase in promotion rates and so forth as a result. I think, you know, it needs to be more than that. And I think that to answer your question truly, Adeline, I think there's 5 things. I think one is the strategy, tying it to what you do, right? There's plenty of tech firms that will talk about deracializing algorithms, but still don't do it. So we still have, you know, some technology which has got racial bias in it, whether it's automatic taps, hand dryers, or driverless cars. So it needs to be in the strategy, right? Then the data, which we've talked about, we extensively. Then there's the governance. How are decisions made? So I love the Bank of England's idea of author in the room, right? Getting an expert into the room to inform the decision when it's being made, rather than relying on papers passed up through the hierarchy. And things like network groups, diversity councils, being a standing agenda item on execos and boards, right? How governance works. I think then leadership. And not just leadership for minorities, but actually embedding this in leadership for everybody, especially white guys. That actually, this is not a kind of side activity or a Friday afternoon CSR activity. This is how you lead a modern organization. And, you know, having empathy for the fact that a lot of good people and good allies or wannabe allies struggle because they're just so full up. The pressures of decision-making at the moment are so full, and they have an empathy deficit. And so we need to actually kind of frame this for them as a resource, not as another thing to do. And that actually, by actually including difference, reaching out particularly to Black talent, right, and gaining kind of, you know, education for yourself and lived experience for yourself, it actually de-risks the decisions that you are accountable for. So completely framing this as a resource and a professional norm, I think, is important. And the final thing I'd say is it's about debiasing systems, isn't it? So, you know, I still see, you know, professional services firms with, you know, psychological assessments, using proverbs that, you know, you need to have a degree in English literature from Oxford to understand, or you know, using cultural reference points, which are kind of, you know, golf, you know. So we need to actually de-bias these things that are actually basically white male norms and actually make them far more inclusive. So there's 5 things I'd do, but if you want to start anywhere, be led by the data, do an intervention like a sponsorship program.
Thank you very much, Steve. One thing I'm keen for us to just talk about really quickly is we've almost started from an assumption that actually within organizations, we're starting from a place where everybody wants to have these difficult conversations and people are to some degree brought on board as it relates to this agenda. And I'm mindful that one of the points that Sandra mentioned was challenging in a supportive way. So when somebody last year on an ongoing basis challenges and says, actually, all of this talk about race is too much, people are working within a meritocracy, you know, Black Lives Matter isn't the thing we should be saying all lives matter. How do you safely challenge that within a work forum to lead to broader engagement, broader inclusion, because we recognize that actually shifting the dial cannot just be those from historically underrepresented groups leading the charge. So Rachel, I want to come to you for a start on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. A really interesting point. So there's a couple of things I'd think. First of all, I think you've got to get some way to get them to understand the problem. So one of the things that we've done, which I think has been really effective in this area, is reverse mentoring, where we've essentially paired people with colleagues that have really got these experiences to hear from them directly, because I think it's much harder for them to say it's not real if they're hearing it from a personal perspective. And we then built on that in developing our Allies program in 2020, where we encourage people in Atos to take the opportunity to learn about different areas of diversity. And, you know, earlier I mentioned our ally race sessions. One of the things we do in that, and we do that across all areas of diversity, we're building on ally sessions, is we bring in personal examples. So we have case studies of employees, that people that they would potentially know, you know, could be their friends, could be individuals across the organization that they haven't met, but the point is they're real people. You know, it's not this kind of theoretical idea. They're real people with real experiences. And I've found that that individual perspective has really helped us to engage people who might be otherwise kind of a bit skeptical about it. And if you can then start to sort of sow that seed that it's not so far away from them, and actually colleagues and friends may be experiencing it, you can start to have more individualized conversations. So it's really interesting, because one of the things that I did recently was I talked to a group of people that had specifically clicked prefer not to declare, and I had a really interesting conversation with one individual about why they'd chosen to do that, and they essentially said the things that we've been talking about here. You know, I believe in meritocracy, I don't think it matters or whatever. So what was interesting is having a one-to-one conversation with that person. I literally phoned them up and talked to them about it, and actually explaining why this stuff is important and how it affects people. He changed his mind from being really kind of against it to really for it, and is now one of a really vocal, active change champion. So I definitely think there's a value to having individual conversations and giving across those personal examples.
Great, fantastic. And Sandra, of course, you're working across this space and probably have heard comments and conversations like that at a suite of different organizations. Do you have any thoughts that you can share on this? Oh, Sandra, you might be on mute. I don't know if that's just me on my side.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, what has come up is how do you persuade or convince those who are like, why are we even talking about this? Or I don't think this is a thing. And I agree with some of the, you know, just say there about getting people to hear stories from your own employee data, your own employee, changing the percentages into numbers and telling the story about what it would look like if actually things were fair. So this is what representation would look like at this level. For example, we should really have 50 people, we've only got 5, you know, from different backgrounds or whatever. So really bring it into living color, because that everybody in the UK has a strong sense of it's fair play, right? Everybody believes everything's fair. What's the problem? And it's as you start to paint the picture of what fairness actually looks like, if we really were representing the local population and the talent that's available in the UK at different levels, and this is what it actually does look like, that's one of the ways to humanize and also what's the impact of it not being right on individuals, their families, and all the extended people who potentially may be relying on them for support. Really just humanize this, not just be about what some people say is political correctness gone mad or whatever, and then starting to having that kind of conversation about we are, you know, as an organization, again, grounded in this is our values, this is what we care about, this is how we want to treat our customers, our clients, as well as our employees. What do we then do to ensure that we can say hand on heart, actually, it really is fair in this organization? So I think definitely converting those numbers to those percentages to numbers, and then really thinking about what's the impact of the people as far as on those numbers who are on your team and who are colleagues that you work with.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sandra. I now want us to move into the broader audience Q&A. Sandra, I know you are leaving us at this point, so just want to say thank you very much for your contributions. So see you soon. But for those of you sticking with us, I want to kickstart a question, and I'm going to go to Steve, to you first. So one of the questions that we've had in from the audience is, as a white middle-class, middle-aged individual, I'm responsible for driving the EDI agenda, but do feel a bit sort of self-conscious around this. Have you got any tips or thoughts to help with, one, that feeling of guilt, but two, actually how to then drive forward through that and recognize that I have a valuable contribution to add to this discussion and this agenda as well?
No, great, thanks. I mean, you know, here I am as a white middle-aged person right on this call. I think the fact that you might feel guilt or vulnerability, whatever, you know, own it, right? I mean, like, rather than that being a kind of a blocker for you, I think is actually part of the solution, right? I mean, there's all the Brené Brown stuff on vulnerability and what have you as well, right? But I think if actually you can display humility, display vulnerability, it will actually encourage people to your cause and actually elicit support and genuine allyship from other people too. I think obviously also educating yourself. So, you know, I've been doing diversity inclusion for 20 plus years. I've read a lot, know a lot, teach a lot. But as a white guy, there's some stuff I'm never going to know, right? So I've got to educate myself quite a lot, surround myself with people who are as different as I possibly can, make sure that, you know, nothing about us without us. So if you are doing anything for anybody, we're definitely including it, so it's kind of ground up. So I think there's a few kind of basics like that. You know yourself, read up, educate yourself, be vulnerable, own that space. Build allies, diverse allies, and make sure you listen and include so that it's genuinely co-created. And then, you know, like, put in place really concrete milestones that give you actually a feeling that we are making progress, we are moving forwards. Because, you know, I've been working at this a long time and we've made a lot of progress, but you do realize that this is a big challenge. And so you need little kind of, you know, wins on the way to keep people kind of motivated and feeling like we are actually getting somewhere.
Thank you, Steve. Another question that's come in from the audience is the query around tackling diversity one characteristic at a time. And that the challenge is, through tackling diversity one characteristic at a time, are we just teaching people about that characteristic, or are we really creating environments and organizations that truly understand how to be more inclusive? Sasha, I want to come to you first on that one.
Thank you. I think this is a great question, because the essence of making everyone feel comfortable at home, have an equal voice in the organisation, is the essence of inclusive leadership. We've just been doing some thinking on this point, and crucially, our leaders and managers on it. So often people think perhaps about leadership, about where are we going, what we're going to achieve, all of this, but it's the essence of really effective and inclusive leadership is the impact that you have on others. And by having a positive, making sure, working towards having a positive impact on all the staff that you are responsible for, and the way that's in a hierarchical sense of leadership. Obviously, there's all sorts of other forms of leadership. Being attuned to that, being aware, thinking through, understanding, developing the antennae and the skills for having a positive effect on all your colleagues. And that means making people feel comfortable that they can speak out, making them challenge the difficult questions. You've actually even use their voice, to share their voice, feel part of each of the conversations. That is a broader skill set. And I think looking at it through that lens, I think that's a good thing that organisations can do, because then you're not, as the questioner rightly calls out, saying, well, if I just sort of focus on something very narrow over here and get that language right, then I've achieved it. You haven't. The outcome is that people feel comfortable, they're attracted to your organisation, they want to work for you as an individual or in your culture. That for me is the measure of success here, and that's a broader training and reinforcing approach. For example, at the Bank of England, we now everybody has to have a diversity and inclusion objective, and that doesn't mean I've just been on a course, let me tick. It's actually people having to evidence how they've engaged with the issues, whether they've an ally in a certain direction, also pulling together how they manage meetings, how they chair things, how they share information, the whole panoply of what it means to lead and work in an organisation. So those, I think, are some areas that if you work on that broad-based agenda as well as the individual ones, then you'll get a better outcome.
And talking about working across that broader agenda, there have been some concerns raised that actually, you know, by using the terminology BAME, we're using it to mask specific issues, or actually when organisations use the term BAME, what they're actually talking about is Black. Do you worry that there's a fear or a position by which we might be excluding other ethnic minorities through the level of focus that we have at the moment? Rachel, I want to go to you on that one.
This is a really interesting point, isn't it? Because it's almost kind of partly, I guess, the opposite of some of the other things we've talked about, because I think especially in the tech sector, I mean, Debbie obviously mentioned at the beginning of the call that if you use the term BAME, I mean, certainly I could say we would see this in our own business, is that we have quite a high proportion of Asian males. So actually we've had to take that focus down further and look at, well, when we're looking at that term, where is our real challenge? And it is around Black colleagues more so. So I think you have to probably take a really independent lens to what your business is and what your makeup is. And I agree. I think, as with all of these discussions, you can't just lump everyone into one term. In fact, you need to be conscious of what is your individual circumstance in your business, and perhaps, like Sandra mentioned earlier, using the census data to then look up at, you know, which of those minorities have you got in your business, and what is the representation like across the broad range of them. I think it's probably just important not to ever just look at a term in isolation, but think wider than that. And I think, you know, again, this comes back to continue to ask your staff. If that's what you're doing and they're feeling that other ethnic minorities are being excluded, you need to continue to create that psychologically safe environment where they can express that concern to you. So ask the question and, you know, try and identify from your staff if that is a problem for you, whilst also continuing to be led, I think, a little bit by your specific example of your organisation and where your focuses need to lie to really address a challenge around proportional representation.
Thank you very much. I'm really conscious of time. And so what I'm now going to ask each of us to do is to just think about one key takeaway action to make organisations more equitable and inclusive for colleagues from historically underrepresented ethnic groups, and specifically the Black piece, because that's what we've been talking about quite a lot today. So Sasha, can I come to you first to get your one key takeaway for those listening to our panel today?
I think it's actually to create action. It's the role modelling, reverse mentoring, and that role modelling network to support progression through the organisations. I'm giving you two answers. Firstly, you want to get everybody in. That's really important. And then support progression through role modelling networks.
Fantastic. Stephen,
Thanks,
your one key takeaway?
I think be the change. It's you, right? So inclusion is literally one person meeting one person at a time. So if you look at the progress we've made in LGBT rights, for example, over the last decade, that's largely because most straight people know someone that's LGBT and they're not afraid. With Black race, Black in particular, still in 2021, most white people don't really know a Black person. And so it's about actually reaching out one-to-one, human to human, and actually building connections and building relationships. And we can all do that.
Great, fantastic. And Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo and what Sasha and Stephen have said as well, but I would build on it further and say inclusive leadership. I think inclusive leadership is the most important skill for leaders for the next decade, honestly. Having your top senior, your CEO and your board really driving a ethnicity diversity focus and a diversity focus at a wider lens as well. I certainly see at Atos, our CEO is the spearhead of our pledge around ethnicity, and that absolutely allows you to really drive that progress. It means that every single decision you're making is being endorsed by them, so they by then driving inclusive leadership behaviors to their own teams and setting that expectation, it trickles through the organization and completely drives the strategy towards inclusion.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So we have heard a wealth of information from our panelists today, and I'm going to quickly try and summarize a number of the key points. So I think a critical point that's been mentioned is the importance of accountability and the importance of seeing visible senior leadership leading on this agenda in an inclusive way that engages the broader organization. I think the second piece is around looking at and listening to your employees. So gathering data, gathering information, hearing the sentiment, feeling and experiences on the ground, and using that as a mechanism of information to drive forward what it is you might change across the organization. I think the third point is around being specific. Let's recognize that certain experiences of certain groups are going to be different within your organization, and it's okay to engage, support, and drive equitable, proactive solutions to make sure that you can see the change that you want to be. The fourth is around making sure that you actually invest appropriate resources to get this stuff done, and that it's aligned to the broader business strategy and doesn't happen within isolation of a little bubble, or leaving the work of network groups to be the means by which you educate everybody else across the organization. There is that individual level of accountability to increase individual awareness and education yourself, and that could be via going out reading, leveraging resources, or as Steve just said, that one-to-one interaction whereby you just get to know somebody who is from a different background. And finally, it's making sure that all of this stuff is reviewed on an ongoing basis. So data, qualitative, quantitative, measure your organization, set objectives, set targets, and recognize how you are moving forward on an ongoing basis, not just at key moments whereby something like the tragic death of George Floyd happens. So with that, I'm going to hand back over to Debbie and want to thank each and every one of you for joining us on the discussion today.
And thank you so much, Edleen. Another masterful job of facilitating the panel that really know their stuff and shared a lot of gold nuggets today. So thank you very much. Those of you who gave us questions, those of you who have completed the poll, we appreciate that. That's part of that ongoing conversation with you. Remember, this is the first time we've done a Flexi Festival, and it's really important for us to know what's working, what's not working from your perspective. So if you go back down below, there's one more tab that gives you a link to an event survey. Look, if there's something great you loved or something that just didn't work, please tell us. Then if you were on this call and you felt, look, but I'm an SME, I'm a startup, or I'm just so much earlier on this, I need to go much more back to basics. That's okay. We can help. Join us today when we have our working lunch, where you'll hear from a panel on how your company can really go back to basics, start working on this agenda, whatever your company size. If you've not signed up for that session, we'd love to have you. Or this evening, looking at our session on social inclusion and what you can do to really move the dial for your company in this space. Thank you for joining us. It's been lovely having a morning coffee with you. I hope to see you again. Please continue to share things on social media. I look forward to seeing you at another session. Thanks.